If it's Thursday, it is day 2 of jury deliberations in Donald Trump's criminal trial. As jurors consider the evidence from both sides, a new poll suggests that voters are digging in ahead of November, regardless of which way the verdict goes. Plus, a major shift in U.S. policy tied to the war in Ukraine. A U.S. official confirming to me within the last 15 minutes that President Biden secretly gave Ukraine permission to strike inside Russia with U.S.-provided weapons. And Israeli forces take control of the Gaza-Egypt border, saying that they found tunnels Hamas was using to smuggle weapons there, in a move that aid groups warn could further disrupt the flow of desperately needed humanitarian aid into the region. Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Peter Alexander here in Washington, and for yet another day, we are keeping a very close eye on that courthouse in Lower Manhattan, where at any time a jury could return a verdict in Donald Trump's criminal hush money fraud trial. Jurors have now been deliberating for what is more than 9 hours, deciding the fate of the former president, who of course is the current presumptive Republican presidential nominee. The jury right now is weighing the evidence regarding 34 felony counts of falsifying business records tied to those alleged hush money payments to adult film star Stormy Daniels during the 2016 election. Right now, we are, in effect, in a wait-and-see mode at the courthouse. The last several hours have been relatively quiet. The jury has not made any new requests or issued any new notes since this morning, when they had key sections of testimony from former Trump fixer Michael Cohen and former National Enquirer publisher David Pecker read back to them. The jurors had asked to go back over Pecker's testimony about his conversations with Mr. Trump, in addition to testimony from Pecker and Cohen about a meeting at Trump Tower with Mr. Trump in 2015. The prosecutors say it was during that 2015 meeting that an agreement was made to notify Mr. Trump about negative stories to help his campaign. The jury also asked to rehear parts of Judge Juan Merchan's lengthy and complex jury instructions. As the jury deliberates, Donald Trump remains inside the courthouse. He's there just waiting. He's required to be there for the duration of these deliberations, and it comes as a new national poll by NPR, PBS, and Marist finds that a vast majority of voters say whatever the verdict is in this trial, it's going to do very little to affect their vote. According to the poll, if Mr. Trump is found guilty, 67%, two-thirds of registered voters say it won't make a difference in how they vote. 15% say a guilty verdict will make them more likely to support him. Not surprisingly, those voters are overwhelmingly Republican. 17% say they would be less likely to support him. Also not surprising, most of those voters are Democrats. And an acquittal, by the way, that wouldn't move the needle much either. If Trump is found not guilty, more than 3/4 of registered voters say it will not make a difference in how they vote. That's where we get started with NBC's Yasmin Vasugian. She is outside the courthouse in Lower Manhattan. Paul Callan is a former prosecutor in the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office, a criminal defense attorney as well. Yasmin, let's get to you on the ground there. Tell us what more we know about what's going on inside the jury room, and walk us through the requests that came from the jury today.
Not much, Peter. Got to say, it's being described in the courtroom as a hospital waiting room. Everyone's a little tired, a little anxious as well, as we're all feeling out here, waiting for any kind of additional jury note to come out when that bell actually rings inside the courtroom. But as of now, we're being told no note. It's 4 p.m., obviously. Court usually goes into recess at 4:30. However, the judges said they are willing to work till 6 p.m., so we don't know yet if they're going to go into recess at 4:30 or work till 6 p.m. Hopefully we'll get an answer on that soon, but they've been inside those deliberations ever since 11:15 or so earlier today, after those additional jury instructions were in fact read. It was pages 6 to 35 of Judge Juan Merchan's jury instructions, about 45 minutes of reading of those jury instructions. Let me walk you through quickly some of what that entailed. It was talking about how to draw inferences, giving an example. For instance, if you go to bed, it's not raining, you wake up, up. The streets are wet. Someone's holding an umbrella and walking outside. You might infer, you might come to the conclusion that, in fact, it had rained overnight, or it is raining outside right now without actually seeing rain. Talking about limiting instructions, specifically when it comes, and this is interesting, of course, because they wanted to hear excerpts of testimony from Michael Cohen and David Pecker, limiting instructions when it comes to their testimony. David Pecker and Michael Cohen. David Pecker signing a non-prosecution agreement, saying take that into consideration when it comes to his credibility, not when it comes to saying guilty or not guilty of Donald Trump. Also with Michael Cohen, yes, he pled guilty. Yes, he is a convicted liar. However, take that into consideration when it comes to credibility, not guilty or not guilty when it comes to Donald Trump. They went through talking about not drawing any inferences when it comes to the former president deciding not to testify, reasonable doubt, New York election law, federal election law, tax law as well. Again, pages 6 to 35. Of these jury instructions, 45 minutes or so, and then back into that deliberation room, Peter. And as of now, it could be any minute, it could be any hour, any day. It's anybody's guess right now as to when we're going to get a verdict on this thing.
Yeah, no doubt. So we keep waiting. We also learned a little bit more, Yasmin, about the former president. He got a TV, we're told, inside the room where he's waiting. What do we know about how he is spending his time and who he is with? Again, to be clear, for those watching us right now, he is required throughout these deliberations to stay inside that courthouse.
Yeah, required. Important to use that word carefully, because he is, in fact, required, but only more because of security purposes. It would be too difficult for the former president to be leaving this building and coming back, obviously, because of the security and the security details that the former president needs when he's traveling around the city, hence the reason why he's staying inside the courthouse. By the way, Eric Trump is here today as well. Don Jr. was here yesterday. Laura Trump here yesterday as well. As you mentioned, he did get a TV in the room in which he's waiting in. Jason Miller, who passed by us a little bit earlier, we asked him what's the former president watching in that room. He would not tell us what he is watching. We asked him if he was watching us. He did not tell us if he was watching that either. But in fact, he does have a television. There was a TikTok posted by Don Jr. yesterday alongside his father's, saying jokingly he was helping his father post mean tweets. But beyond that, that's all we know. Alina Habba also speaking to our own Vaughn Hilliard over here, telling him he is working inside that room. He's focused and he is awaiting a verdict.
Yep. Yasmin, thank you very much. Of course, we'll come back to you if we learn anything more over the course of this hour here. We should note Doug Burgum, another man being considered as a possible VP candidate, also there with the president over the course of this day. We want to get to Paul Callan right now, our attorney with the legal expertise we need. Paul, so pull back the curtain for folks who are not lawyers here. What do you read into what the jury wanted to have read back to them today in terms of those instructions?
Well, you know, Peter, it's fascinating that they asked so many questions so quickly. Usually in jury trials, this happens a day or two into the deliberations when they're fighting with each other and somebody says, you should hear this testimony or you should hear this instruction. This jury pretty much asked for a complete readback of the instructions and a lot of the critical evidence to be read back right away. And what that says to me is that as they were listening to the case and listening to the evidence, they didn't realize how complex it was going to be until the judge read the charge, the 55-page charge. And I think they went into the jury room and they said, whoa, we better get parts of that read back. This is very, very complicated. And of course, New York has this rule where they don't submit it in writing to the jury, as they do in most states. And it makes it very difficult for jurors to remember what the law has been instructed in complicated cases.
And Paul, let me just say to the audience who's joining us now, we have just learned from our reporters that are there that the prosecutors are inside the courtroom right now. We don't know specifically why. I just want to ask our producers, have we heard if the judge is in the courtroom as well, or simply that the prosecutors? We don't know yet. We'll try to get more information on that. So there's some movement of some kind, but obviously before anything significant occurs, we believe everybody would clearly be in the courtroom. Let me ask you quickly, though, about the instructions that were read. Why not just give the jurors the instructions on a laptop that they have access to right now?
Well, you know, the New York Court of Appeals has ruled previously, and that's the highest court in New York, that they don't want this done, that it will be too confusing for the jury to have the instructions in writing. And I think it's an idiotic ruling, frankly.
It doesn't make a ton of sense to those of us just paying attention to you. Yeah.
But New York is very backward in so many ways with the way it runs its legal system compared to other states across the country. Less technology, less bending to modernity, in terms of what they do. But I think they're going to learn a lesson this time. Maybe the law will be changed because of this.
Obviously, we're only toward the end of day 2. This thing could go on for a period of time. But just for a layperson sort of understanding, the longer this goes, does that just give us a better sense that they're more and more likely to be hung? Or, is there sort of a sweet spot right now? We're still in the early stages, I guess, of this deliberation.
It's very hard to predict. But, we're early on when you consider that this case went on for 22 witnesses and 6 weeks. Now, with days off and everything, maybe it was more like a 3-week trial. But right. I would expect 3 or 4 days of deliberation on a case that went that long. I think what's interesting is that now that the readback was done by the judge, he re-instructed them, he gave them the evidence, no more questions today. That means, I think, that they're having very productive discussions in that jury room. When they start to fight with each other, a lot of times that's when you see a lot of notes coming out to the judge saying, well, could you read back this item of evidence? Could you re-instruct on this particular point? But we've got no more questions now. So that says to me, wherever they're going, they're making some progress, I think. And I don't think you'll see a verdict today, maybe tomorrow, but you never know with jurors.
Well, interesting. You talk about possibly going 3 or 4 days. 3 days means they end on a Friday. 4 days means this thing goes through the weekend, right? And that can always be interesting in a trial and a jury deliberation of this kind. I want to ask you about part of what Judge Mershon's instructions to the jurors included, specifically with regards to what they call the unlawful means that they could consider while deciding if these alleged falsified documents were part of an effort to cover up another crime. The judge made clear they don't have to all agree on what that other crime was, just that there was another crime that was trying to be covered up here. So they could determine that that was either violations of the Federal Election Campaign Act. They could say it was the falsification of other business records or violation of tax laws. Does the fact that the jury wanted to hear back testimony from David Pecker of the National Enquirer and the 2015 Trump Tower meeting in particular, does that indicate that the jurors are interested, specifically, I don't know, in Judge Mershon's instructions, or were Pecker and Michael Cohen sort of agree?
Well, I think that they asked for that testimony because, remember, Pecker and Cohen are really the link back to former President Trump, because Pecker was doing this catch and kill agreement where if there were bad things coming out about Trump, they would pay for the story and see if they could kill the story. And of course, Cohen was the bag man, says the prosecutor, who was setting up the payment scheme that the money was coming from the trust account of the former president to the people that he wanted to silence. And the outline of that conspiracy can be heard in the readback of the stuff they had with Pecker and Cohen. So I think that's critical evidence in the case, and the jury just wanted to hear that first before they delved into the details of those crimes, those secondary crimes that you're talking about.
Paul, I don't want to interrupt you. I want to get right back to Yasmin Vasugian outside the courtroom really quickly, if I can. Yasmin, try to get a better understanding of what's going on in that courtroom night now. We're getting notes from our team. What more are you learning?
Yeah, again, I'm looking down at my iPad here on my phone as well, where we're getting the document from inside the courtroom. So apologies on why I'm not addressing you, Peter, directly. But we're getting some scattered information here. Judge Juan Mershon has just walked back into the courtroom. Donald Trump is in the courtroom. The defense team is in the courtroom as well. The prosecution is in the courtroom as well. I want to be clear. No bell has been rung, right? Yesterday, a bell was rung. 2 notes came in. Another bell, another note came in. So 3 total notes came in yesterday after bells were rung inside the courtroom. This time, no bell has been rung. The judge, okay, so we just got it in, and Lisa Rubin is reporting this now, our colleague here who's inside the courtroom. The jury is going to be excused at 4:30 p.m. So that is why the prosecution and the defense were back in the courtroom along with Judge Juan Mershon. Let me just remind folks, right, normally we get excused at 4:30 p.m. here in court, and the judge had said, listen, we can work until 6 p.m. depending on where you are in the decision-making process, right? It seems as if they've now made the decision. Judge Juan Mershon has made the decision alongside, of course, obviously talking to the jury, it seems, that they're going to be excused at 4:30 p.m. That likely means they're not very close, and I'm sure Paul can kind of weigh in on this more so, to a decision. If they were closer to a decision, they may have decided to extend to 6 p.m. to possibly come out with a verdict before court went into recess. But because they're being excused at 4:30 p.m., it seems they are not necessarily close to a decision. So court will be back tomorrow morning. Peter.
Yeah, so a little better clarity on that. Yasmin, thank you, Paul. Just to button this all up before we thank you as well. So they're all back in the courtroom, so the judge can say everybody's going home for the day and we pick it up again tomorrow. Is that a fair takeaway?
Fair enough, and I agree with Yasmin completely. They need more time to reach this verdict, and otherwise it would have stayed until 6 o'clock.
So we pick it up in the morning, and we'll surely see you back here on this platform again tomorrow, I trust. Paul Callan, we really appreciate you. We want to get to our panel now. On set with me, Betsy Woodruff-Swan, national correspondent for Politico, Simone Sanders-Townsend, former senior advisor to Vice President Kamala Harris and co-host of The Weekends on MSNBC, and Danielle Pletka, senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Glad you guys are with us. We were all sort of watching that play out in real time. It seemed like we might have some excitement. Turns out everybody's going home to have some dinner.
I went to pull up the document. I'm like, is this happening? And
is this a document? The document is that they want to be dismissed, that they're going home.
No one is going to have any adrenal glands by the time this is done.
At some point, this is a lot of speculation game. So let's talk the big picture about why this matters and what this means. There's new polling today about it broadly, gives us a sense of where Americans are on this issue. How in particular has this trial impacted the race? We really have sort of been frozen in place in a lot of ways, as evidenced by new polling as well.
There is, thus far, I think, from most of the public polling, it's pretty clear that the trial has not been helpful to the president's re-election bid. At the bare minimum, we can say that. There hasn't been any dramatic or meaningful hit that Trump has seen in his polling numbers. Flies completely in the face of conventional wisdom over the last year or so since his indictment, since his legal troubles really started metastasizing. Of course, the true test of this is going to come on Election Day, but many national Democrats, understandably and reasonably, had hoped that being on trial for crimes related to hush money and a porn star would be a political liability. Thus far, in the polls, we're not seeing that in a meaningful way.
And what's stunning is these polls also, Simone, tell us, the newest ones say whether he's convicted or acquitted is going to change the deal for very few Americans right now. We're going to have a debate. It's only a few weeks away. That's the next sort of shake-up point, as it were, here. But it's clear that the White House had the expectation that, hey, when you see this guy in the courtroom day in, day out, that Americans will really start to get a better understanding of it. Is the White House disappointed, surprised that this hasn't had bigger impact?
You know, I think the White House actually realized, and we saw this earlier this week, when Michael Tyler, the communications director, and some very famous people, very famous individual, Robert De Niro, were outside of the courthouse having a press conference with two former Capitol Police officers who served during January 6th. And when Michael Tyler was asked, well, why are you here? And he said, because you all are here, i.e. you, the press. I think they actually realized that they cannot just allow this to play out and be highbrow about it all. That's usually how some of my former colleagues at the White House like to operate. They like to be highbrow. We're the White House. Well,
they're saying they got to make sure people get this, right?
Yeah, because this is very different than the last court proceeding we saw, actually. And the one where I'm thinking of is Fani Willis and her hearing. It was appointment television. Why? Because it was a little salacious, but it was broadcast on live television. Anyone could tune in and watch it anywhere.
Right.
This is not that. We are reading from a transcript, and although there are some very dramatic reads, it is not the same thing as live television. I think that's part of the reason this court case has not pierced everyday, the everyday non-political group chat bubble, if you will, as the Fani Willis case did.
And as you make clear, and the White House aides have said to me, like, the expectation was, and they hope with the debate, it'll make it clear, Danny, to the audience, to Americans, hey, this is a choice between these two. A lot of Americans, surprisingly, don't realize Donald Trump's likely to be the Republican, is the presumptive Republican nominee. They wanted this all to be clear for them. That hasn't happened to this point. Maybe it happens when the two stand side by side. But for Donald Trump, has this harmed him in any form? It's given him a platform each and every day to stand before the cameras and be on television each night.
I mean, it's really interesting. This is sort of unknown territory. We've never had a former president of the United States in court as Donald Trump is. I think it's a real double-edged sword, and I'm not saying anything I think we haven't all said before and are going to say again about this, which is, number one, this has the sort of Joe Biden in the basement effect, right? Donald Trump is often his own worst enemy. He's actually off the scene. He's not saying that much. He's being meted out to the public in much smaller doses. That is, on the whole, good for him. Also, for a lot of people, they think he's a victim. Now, we may not agree, we may, but it deepens that sense that the establishment is out to persecute Donald Trump, and that's helpful to him as well. So I think the real shoe that drops is exactly what both of you have said, which is, if there's a conviction, then all of a sudden we need to ask people, now what do you think? My guess is they think what they thought before the conviction.
I think what these polls also reflect is sort of a broad, decades-long trend of Americans' trust in institutions being in a free fall. The fact that our criminal justice system in so many different jurisdictions can accuse Trump of multiple crimes, and it doesn't affect his polling by any reasonable metric.
A lot of it has to do with Mr. Trump himself, mind you.
A lot has to do with Trump himself, but the fact that people don't have confidence in the justice, that so many people don't have confidence in the Justice Department, that people even say that a conviction wouldn't change their view of him. More broadly, it's part of us living in a culture where many institutions have taken extraordinary reputational blows, and we're seeing the product of that now.
And a reminder, as we've seen so many times, right at the end of the day, for the wishful Democrats who thought this might be resolved in a courtroom, if you're going to beat Donald Trump, it's going to have to happen at the ballot box.
Absolutely, at the ballot box. That's the only place, frankly, Democrats were ever going to beat Trump. Any of these court cases could have impacted the thinking, but it would not take him out of the race. I think the only thing that the court case has done to damage Donald Trump is his inability to be on the campaign trail and fundraise. He is cash-strapped, and the kind of events that the former president likes to put together, those are events that cost anywhere between $15,000 and $20,000 a pop per event, with the pomp and circumstance, the stage, the pipe and draping. That costs money.
Let me push back on this for a half second, though, Simone. Donald Trump gets free media every day.
It is crazy to me,
and
yes.
You can't put a price tag on it, right? So we talk about, hey, Joe Biden's got a lot more money than Donald Trump, but Donald Trump is sitting there giving a news conference on live television almost every day.
Yeah, but news conferences do not make voters turn out to the polls.
Okay.
He needs money to build infrastructure to literally turn people out. This, at the end of the day, I think is going to be a turnout election still. It's going to be a close election.
Yep.
It's going to be a turnout election. And the lack of infrastructure investment from the Republican National Committee and the Trump campaign, I think will hurt them come November.
What you're saying is really smart. And this, I really do agree with. There's no partisan spin to this one. Donald Trump has focused so much on himself and on buttressing the people around him, getting his daughter-in-law and a crony into the Republican National Committee. They have not done what's necessary at the state level. And while I think it'll still be very difficult for the Democrats, the reality is this stuff matters. It costs money. It requires organization and professionalism. And that is something that we really are not seeing yet.
Yeah, all good points. Appreciate you guys being with us. Betsy, Danny, Simone, we'll have you stick around for a little bit. We got more news to talk about. Coming up, brand new reporting on the Biden administration's decision to secretly allow Ukraine to use U.S. weapons in strikes inside Russia. The very latest from the White House and from the Pentagon is next. Plus, extreme heat hits the world's largest election. Voters in India are sweating it out while heading to the polls amid a brutal, record-breaking heat wave. Get this, temperatures unofficially hitting 126 degrees. New reporting from New Delhi is straight ahead. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. We do have some news that's breaking from the White House. The Biden administration quietly made a significant shift in policy when it comes to U.S.-supplied weapons to Ukraine. In just the past few minutes, a U.S. official confirmed to me that President Biden secretly gave Ukraine permission to use U.S.-supplied weapons to strike inside Russia, but solely around the city of Kharkiv. That's the second largest city in Ukraine. It comes at a crucial time as Russia continues to make gains in northeast Ukraine, specifically targeting that Kharkiv region. This move from President Biden follows similar announcements by the French president, President Macron, German Chancellor Scholz, who both said they support Ukraine using weapons to strike targets in Russia. Joining me now on set is NBC News global security reporter Dan DeLuce. Kelly O'Donnell, my colleague, is at the White House for the latest. Kelly, let's get to you quickly. This is a notable shift in policy by the White House, and it comes amid a lot of pressure right now on the administration to get on the same page as what NATO and America's European allies have been saying.
That's right, Peter. And the original intent here was President Biden and his administration wanted to be careful to provide weapons, but to not be so provocative that American weapons could be used inside Russia, perhaps drawing the U.S. into a direct conflict with Russia. That has been one of the principal ideas behind the president's approach since the war in Ukraine began. Now we're at a point 2+ years into the fighting where what we see is that Ukraine has suffered dramatic setbacks over just the relentless push from Russia, and some of that is staged inside Russia and then targeting Ukraine. And so making this adjustment, which, as you pointed out, is aligned with some of the thinking of European allies who are also critically important in support for Ukraine, would allow Ukraine to prevent those attacks by striking inside Russia at the bases or operation points where Russian soldiers and forces are working on their own land, but projecting munitions into Ukraine. So that's the sort of scope that we're talking about here. This isn't about going to Moscow or a more aggressive approach, but trying to prevent damage by attacking inside Russia where needed.
And Dan, let me bring you into this conversation a bit. And you and I were talking in the break here, right? This is part of a pattern, and it's one that conservatives, Republicans have criticized the White House on here, which is them sort of slow walking in the eyes of these critics, being reluctant before finally agreeing. Tanks, fighter jets, and beyond. The White House recognizing they needed to do more to help Ukraine sort of take the handcuffs off.
That's right. And it's really, you see friction now between the Ukrainian government and the White House because of this pattern. You often have Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, Bill Burns, the CIA director, staking out the bolder, more aggressive stance in those policy deliberations. The end result is the White House and the president come around, but the Ukrainians will say, look at the time lost, look at the lives lost, and now you have a fairly desperate situation there in the north, and they desperately feel they need to hit Russian forces just over the border.
So specifically it is to try to keep this in a narrow realm. As we heard from Kelly there, the desire is not to start targeting Moscow, go nowhere near Vladimir Putin, so to speak, in the Kremlin here, but really to try to target these forces and other launch points where this offensive is coming from, right?
That's right, because the White House wants to send a message, too, to Moscow. Like, you know, we don't want a direct conflict with Russia. That's right. But so this is a limited area around the border. Having said that, Ukraine on its own, with its drones that they make themselves, have been striking inside Russia repeatedly in these kinds of sabotage actions where they hit oil facilities or they hit an air base. So those will continue, and of course, that's really angered Moscow.
And Kelly, what I'm struck by here is if we put this into political terms quickly, you got what's going on in Gaza with Israel. You got what's going on between Russia and Ukraine. Is that in a lot of ways, as it relates to the president's foreign policy, I guess his future, his fate is dependent on things out of his control, what Vladimir Putin in Russia decides to do, in effect what Benjamin Netanyahu is deciding to do. There is only so much control this president has had, but here's an opportunity where they're trying to at least try to seize some control and do more.
As so often the case with the president, outside events or other actors can dramatically affect the set of cards that the president must play, and that certainly is true here. We've seen the resistance among lawmakers about supplying Ukraine, as you were talking about delays that might be coming from administration choices. That's been coupled with the delays in getting funding for Ukraine. And it also comes at a time before the G7 summit, which is coming up in Italy in early June. And tomorrow, the Belgian prime minister, of course, NATO is housed in Belgium, will be here at the White House. And it begins a kind of renewed sense of these conversations with European partners about the U.S. role in trying to defend and protect Ukraine and help it in its own operations against Russia without going beyond that. And of course, politically, for the president, he separates the decisions he needs to make as commander-in-chief. But the overall politics are certainly being watched by voters here at home who are weary of some of these interventions. And at the same time, you also do see support for a sovereign democratic country like Ukraine among some of the electorate. So it's a hard needle to thread for the president, and he's trying to maintain and show leadership that the U.S. can bring Europeans together and he can be a supportive partner when they sometimes take an early lead on certain things.
Yeah, all smart points there, Kelly. Dan, I want to ask you one other question on a separate topic. This is relating specifically to the defense intelligence community right now, releasing new findings about debris from a missile attack that was discovered inside Ukraine, and the determination was made with, as they describe it, almost certainly that this came from a North Korean missile. This is a big revelation. If it proves to be true, it means that the Russian relationship with North Korea, which we knew to be tight, was even stronger. That North Korea could be providing munitions specifically to Russia right now. How concerned is the U.S. about this? And frankly, how concerned should we be about this pattern and it's the way it's going?
I think it's very concerning, and the intelligence community has been warning now for a while. You have this deepening kind of alliance between Russia, North Korea, and most of all, China.
Yeah.
And this is a case where you have North Korea already helping Russia, giving them a lot of artillery ammunition. And then in this case, they're actually using North Korean ballistic missiles. And they used, the DIA looked at photos, publicly available photos.
Defense Intelligence Agency.
And they just show that, you know, look, these missiles are clearly North Korean. And they came to that conclusion. So it's yet another example of this kind of what the U.S. considers this kind of nefarious network of authoritarian states, all lining up against Ukraine and other democratic countries.
Yeah, also revealing that Vladimir Putin needs the assistance of other countries to have the munitions he needs to continue this war, now 2.5 years old. Dan DeLuce, thank you. Kelly O'Donnell at the White House. Kel, always good to see you. Coming up next, rising concerns that Israel's seizure of another key border crossing into Gaza could deepen the already dire humanitarian crisis. We're going to have the very latest on the war there. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. I'm Peter Alexander. Conditions in Gaza are, quote, worse now than ever before. That's according to the USAID Administrator Samantha Power. In a post on X, formerly Twitter, Power went on to say Israeli military operations and closed crossings are making it extremely difficult to distribute aid. This comes as the UN says that aid distribution into Gaza has dropped by 67% since Israel seized control of the Rafah border crossing earlier this month. Yesterday, Israel announced that it has expanded that control and now has operational control over the entire border between Egypt and Gaza, known as the Fidelfi Corridor. NBC News International Correspondent Sanchez has more from Tel Aviv.
Hey there. Israeli forces say they have seized control of the entirety of the Gaza-Egypt border. They refer to it as the Philadelphia Corridor, and they say it is of military significance because that's where the Hamas cross-border tunnels are, which they use to smuggle weapons, supplies from Egypt into Gaza. Now, the IDF says they have discovered 20 of those tunnels so far. I asked an Israeli official whether they have been operational since October 7th or not. They said they weren't able to tell at this point. They also say they've discovered Hamas rocket launchers right up against the border, which they believe Hamas specifically placed there in the hope that Israel would not bomb in that area for fear of striking Egyptian troops on the other side. But all of this comes after days of Israeli strikes that have caused significant civilian casualties, dozens of Palestinian civilians killed, many of them women and children. And Secretary of State Antony Blinken is urging Israel to consider whether what he called the incremental military gains it is making in Rafah is worth the human cost. He is urging Israel to swiftly investigate that deadly strike on Sunday night local time, which ignited a firestorm at a camp for displaced people, killing at least 45, according to the emergency services in Gaza. Israel says it is investigating and that it was targeting 2 Hamas commanders who were inside of that camp. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu also meeting yesterday with both former South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley and Senator Lindsey Graham, and he urged both of them to push the United States to impose sanctions on the International Criminal Court. The court's chief prosecutor, of course, is seeking the arrest of Prime Minister Netanyahu for alleged war crimes in Gaza, including the starvation of Palestinian civilians there. Accusations he denies. Back to you.
Sanchez with the very latest for us from Tel Aviv. We do have some breaking news that we have just learned. A verdict has been reached by the jury in former President Donald Trump's hush money fraud trial. To be clear, a verdict has been reached. The jury has not been dismissed for the day, as was initially indicated here. We are getting our teams together and expect that we will get that information in a short period of time. The verdict has not been read to this point so far. Again, a reminder that the former President Donald Trump right now is facing a total of 34 separate counts. These counts relate specifically to an effort to try to cover up, in the eyes of prosecutors, a separate crime that was committed as related to the 2016 election by the former president. I want to get to Paul Callan, our attorney, who's with us. Paul, when we said hello and goodbye to you a few moments ago, we thought that the jury was being dismissed for the day. It's only 9+ hours into its deliberation. They asked for a little bit of testimony to be reread. They asked for some of the jury instructions to be reread. And then in not too much time, they have come to some conclusion. What do you make of this, and what do you think this indicates?
Wow, this is a real shocker. I really expected that they would be out at least until the end of the day tomorrow and probably into next week because of the number of charges. There are 34 charges here that they have to go through methodically.
But 34 of them, Paul, to be clear, all 34 are in 3 buckets, right? So it's sort of that if you agree to one, you agree to all 11, and all 12.
Well,
but you make a good point.
That's true. And the other truth of this case is that if he's even convicted on 1 count, it's probably the same thing as 34 because he's not going to get consecutive sentences. The max sentence is 4 years for it. So, and he's probably not even going to get jailed for that.
Well, yeah, I was going to say, let me ask you about that specifically. And the judge made very clear it's not up to, he got upset at the defense attorney there, saying that, hey, it's not up to you to suggest that this guy would be getting jail time if the jurors come back with a guilty verdict here. Is a guilty verdict likely to mean jail time in your view, acknowledging we don't know what the verdict is?
All I can look at are the statistics on this, and it's 1 in 10 convictions of this offense results in a jail sentence, and almost always that's somebody with an extensive prior record, and usually charges like these are tied with other charges, tax violations, corporate violations that cause a judge to give a jail sentence. It would be highly, highly unusual for him to get a jail sentence. The only reason that he'd get it is because the judge might be so angry at him because he's been held in contempt essentially 10 times for out-of-court statements, and he really has angered the judge. But I think this judge is wise enough to step back and sentence Trump just like he would any other person convicted of this kind of crime. And usually it's probation or a fine for a first offense for this.
Paul, stay with us. Let me get to Yasmin Vasugian. I do want to let our audience know that as soon as we have our team together, we're going to have a special NBC News report. Yasmin, what are you seeing on the ground there outside the courthouse? What more are we learning?
So we have a verdict. As you're reporting, we thought that a jury was going to go into recess at 4:30. In fact, we have a verdict. A note came in just a couple of minutes ago. There was some conversation happening inside the court, and now, in fact, we have a verdict. We don't know what the verdict is yet. Marshana's reading a direct quote of the note sent by the jury. Let me read it for you now. We, the jury, have a verdict. We would like an extra 30 minutes to fill out the forms, if that would be possible. Let me walk you through what's going to happen. So the jury foreperson, they're going to fill out the forms in that jury deliberation room. Once those forms are filled out, Peter, they're going to come back in to the courtroom. The jury foreperson will then read out the verdict count by count. I want to remind folks there are 34 counts here involving 12 counts with regards to ledgers, 11 counts with regards to invoices, 11 counts with regards to checks. After they have read out all of those counts, the judge must then ask the jury foreperson if everybody agrees with the verdicts that have just been read out by the jury foreperson, and they must all then agree. This is also so there is no mistrial, and also for appeal purposes as well, so that everybody is in agreement and it's on the record as well. So right now we are waiting for the jury to fill out this form for this verdict. Once they do, they'll be brought back into the courtroom. That verdict will then be read. Let me walk you through who's inside the courtroom right now. The entire prosecution team is inside that courtroom. I do not have an indication as to whether or not DA Alvin Bragg is inside that courtroom. I know that Donald Trump himself, the former president of the United States, presumptive Republican nominee for president, as well as inside that courtroom. Todd Blanche, his lead attorney, is inside that courtroom. Susan Necheles as well. Bovee, one of his attorneys, as well as inside that courtroom. Eric Trump, his son, is in the courtroom as well as Andrew Giuliani, Rudy Giuliani's son. They are all awaiting this verdict that could really change the course of history in this country, I would say, and is something that many of us have been waiting on pins and needles, this country really, to hear what happens inside that courtroom behind us. Remember, 6 weeks, Peter, this trial has been ongoing, this Trump hush money trial. It is not the trial that we thought would go forward first. These 4 criminal trials in which the former president is facing, however, it is the trial that did in fact go first. And it may be the only trial to happen before the November election.
Right.
And what comes out of that courtroom, Peter, behind us may very well set into motion what will happen in November as we await a verdict in the Trump hush money trial.
Yasmin will allow you to do a little more reporting there, see what other detail and color you can get from behind the scenes. You can imagine that courtroom right now as the president had been sitting there in effect cooling his heels for most of this entire day and now learns on the second day of jury deliberations that the verdict has been reached by the jurors, those 12 Manhattanites, coming up with the final decision here. Paul, I want to get back to you for a second on this. Just a couple points of clarification. Again, to be clear, we have no idea what the verdict will be. We don't know if it's a hung jury, an acquittal, a guilty verdict. But to be clear, once a verdict is reached here, Donald Trump, if convicted, is not yet a convicted felon. That wouldn't be the case specifically until a sentencing took place here. But are there any other appeals that could take place here, or is this in effect the final word?
Well, there can be an appeal here. Obviously, the conviction becomes final when sentencing is completed. And that's not going to happen probably for another month or so, because probation would do a report back to the judge, and the judge would then sentence. Then a notice of appeal is filed, and it goes up to the appellate division, and then eventually it would go up to New York's highest court, the Court of Appeals. So that's how the process works. At this point, yeah.
Paul, we appreciate that. I want you guys to stay with us. Paul, stay with us. Yasmin Vasugian, stay with us. Our panel is with us as well right now. We are going to have an NBC News special report. Again, the breaking news at this time is that a verdict has been reached by the jurors in the hush money fraud trial for the former president, Donald J. Trump. We await and hope within the next 30 minutes to know that conclusion. Here's this NBC News special report.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.